You know what's strange? The people who raised you to believe that education and hard work would guarantee success are often the same people who can't understand why you're struggling, despite having more education and working harder than they ever did. Baby boomers didn't just raise millennials, they shaped an entire worldview, a set of promises about how life works, about what effort yields, about what adulthood should look like. And then, when millennials followed those rules and ended up drowning in debt, locked out of homeownership, and piecing together gig work just to survive, many boomers responded not with empathy, but with confusion, frustration, and often judgment. This isn't a generational war. This isn't about calling anyone the villain. But there is a profound psychological disconnect happening, one that leaves millennials feeling invisible, invalidated, and exhausted from explaining a reality that simply doesn't compute for the generation that came before them. The question isn't whether baby boomers care about their children. Most do, deeply. The question is why, despite that care, they often cannot understand what their children are actually experiencing. And the answer lies not in morality, but in psychology. Let's start with the numbers, because this isn't about feelings, it's about material reality. In 1970, the median home price in the United States was roughly 2.2 times the median household income. By 2020, that ratio had ballooned to over 4.5 times median income, and in many metropolitan areas, it exceeded 7 times. A baby boomer working a full-time job could reasonably afford a house within a few years of starting their career. Today, millennials face a housing market where wages have stagnated, while costs have exploded, according to data from the Federal Reserve. Real wages for workers without a college degree have barely budged since 1979. While the cost of housing, healthcare, and education has skyrocketed, college tuition has increased by over 1,200% since 1980, far outpacing inflation. Student loan debt in the U.S. now exceeds $1.7 trillion, a financial burden virtually non-existent for boomers. These aren't minor shifts. These are seismic changes to the economic landscape. Yet, when millennials talk about these realities, they're often met with responses like, "I worked hard too," or "you just need to budget better." The disconnect isn't that boomers don't believe millennials are struggling. It's that they can't see the structural difference between working hard in an economy designed for upward mobility versus working hard in an economy designed for wealth extraction. The rules changed, but the mental framework, DIDN, single quotes TI baby boomers came of age during one of the most economically prosperous periods in modern history. The post-World War II economic expansion created unprecedented opportunity. Manufacturing jobs paid middle-class wages. College was affordable, often nearly free. Homeownership was accessible. Job security was real. Pensions existed. This wasn't just an economic reality, it was a psychological one. When you grow up in a world where effort reliably translates into reward, where hard work genuinely does lead to upward mobility, your brain builds a schema around meritocracy. You internalize the belief that success is primarily a function of individual effort. And when your own life confirms that belief again and again, it becomes foundational to your identity. Psychologists call this experiential blindness, the inability to recognize that your own experience may not be universal. Boomers didn't just benefit from a strong economy. They were psychologically shaped by it. Their sense of self, their understanding of fairness, their beliefs about work and reward, all of it was forged in a world that no longer exists. And here's the problem. When someone's identity is built on the idea that their success came from their own hard work, asking them to acknowledge structural advantage feels like an attack on their character. It's not, but psychologically, it registers that way. There's a concept in psychology called the fundamental attribution error. It describes our tendency to attribute other people's failures to their character, while attributing our own failures to external circumstances. Baby boomers, like all humans, are vulnerable to this bias. When they succeeded, they attributed it to hard work, discipline, and smart choices. When they see millennials struggling, many unconsciously attribute it to laziness, entitlement, or poor decision-making. This isn't malice, it's cognitive bias. Research by social psychologist Richard Nisbett and his colleagues has shown that people consistently overestimate the role of personal agency and underestimate the role of situational factors when evaluating others. For boomers, the meritocracy isn't a myth. It's a lived experience. They worked hard. They bought homes. They raised families. They retired with pensions. So when millennials say, the system is broken, what many boomers hear is, you didn't earn what you have. That's not what millennials are saying, but that's how it lands. And this is where the empathy gap becomes intractable. Because for boomers to fully understand millennial struggle, they would have to reckon with the fact that their own success was in significant part a function of timing and structural advantage. And psychologically, that's an incredibly difficult thing to accept. Here's the cruel irony. Baby boomers raised millennials to follow a very specific blueprint. Go to college, get a degree, work hard, delay gratification, follow the rules. And millennials did. They went to college in record numbers. They accumulated debt, believing it was an investment. They delayed homeownership, marriage, and children because they were told to establish careers first. They followed every piece of advice their parents gave them. And then the economy collapsed. Twice. First, in 2008, right as the oldest millennials were entering the workforce. Then again in 2020, just as many were finally gaining financial footing. The blueprint broke, but the advice didn't change. Even now, many boomers offer the same solutions that worked for them, solutions that no longer apply. Just walk in and ask for a job. Just work your way up. Just buy a house. These suggestions aren't meant to be dismissive. They're offered with genuine care. But they reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of how labor markets, housing markets, and career trajectories now function. And for millennials, this creates a painful psychological double bind. They followed the rules. The rules failed them. And now the people who made the rules are telling them they just aren't trying hard enough. That's not frustration. That's gaslighting, even if unintentional. So why can't baby boomers just see it? Why, despite loving their children, despite wanting them to succeed, do so many struggle to grasp the reality millennials are living? The answer lies in the distinction between cognitive empathy and effective empathy. Effective empathy is the ability to feel what someone else is feeling. Most boomers have this. They see their children stressed, anxious, struggling, and they feel concern. They want to help. But cognitive empathy is different. It's the ability to understand someone else's perspective, to mentally model their reality, even if it's different from your own. And this is where the gap appears. Research by developmental psychologist Hoffman shows that cognitive empathy requires the ability to step outside your own experiential framework. For boomers, whose entire understanding of adulthood was built in a fundamentally different economic and social structure, this is extraordinarily difficult. It's not that they don't care. It's that their mental models of how the world works are so deeply ingrained that new information doesn't fit. Psychologists call this schema rigidity. When reality contradicts a deeply held belief, the brain often rejects the reality rather than updating the belief. So when millennials describe financial precarity, housing inaccessibility, and job insecurity, many boomers unconsciously filter that information through their own experience and conclude, it can't be that bad. I figured it out. They just need to try harder. And then there's the language. Words like entitlement, lazy, and snowflake get thrown around, and they don't just describe behavior. They pathologize an entire generation's response to structural inequality. When a millennial says, I can't afford rent and student loans on my salary, and a boomer responds, you're just entitled, what's really happening? The boomer is interpreting the complaint through their own framework, one where financial struggle was temporary and surmountable. They see the complaint as a character flaw rather than a structural reality. But here's what research on invalidation shows. When someone's reality is repeatedly dismissed, it doesn't just create frustration, it creates psychological harm. Studies on emotional invalidation, particularly work by psychologist Marsha Linehan, show that chronic invalidation contributes to anxiety, depression, and a destabilized sense of self. Millennials aren't just frustrated by the empathy gap, they're psychologically injured by it. Every time their reality is dismissed, it reinforces a message. Your experience isn't real. Your struggles aren't legitimate. You're the problem. And after years of this, many millennials stop trying to explain. They stop seeking validation from the generation that raised them, because the emotional cost is too high. Let's talk about what this does to you. If you're a millennial, you've likely spent years trying to explain your reality to people who fundamentally cannot hear it. You've recited statistics. You've shared your budget. You've explained that you work multiple jobs, that you have a degree, that you're doing everything right, and it still isn't enough. And you've been met with doubt, with advice that doesn't apply, with implications that you're just not trying hard enough. That takes a toll. Research on intergenerational trauma and invalidation shows that when your lived experience is chronically denied by authority figures, particularly parental figures, it creates a kind of psychological fracture. You begin to doubt yourself. You internalize the blame. You start wondering if maybe they're right. Maybe you are the problem, even when the data overwhelmingly shows otherwise. This is what psychologists call gaslighting, and it doesn't require malicious intent. It just requires a persistent refusal to acknowledge someone's reality. And for millennials, this dynamic has contributed to record levels of anxiety, depression, and burnout. Not because they're weak, but because they're living in a world that tells them their struggles aren't real, while simultaneously making those struggles inescapable. So where does this leave us? This isn't about vilifying baby boomers. It's not about painting millennials as helpless victims. It's about recognizing that psychological frameworks, once formed, are incredibly difficult to change. Baby boomers aren't bad people for struggling to understand. They're human. They're operating from a set of beliefs forged in an entirely different world. But that doesn't make the empathy gap any less real, and it doesn't make the consequences any less damaging. What matters now is this: millennials can stop waiting for validation that may never come. You don't need baby boomers to believe you for your reality to be real. The data supports you. The research supports you. Your experience is legitimate, whether or not it's acknowledged. And baby boomers, if you're listening, the ask isn't that you feel guilty. It's that you recognize that your experience, as real as it was, doesn't map onto the world your children are navigating. You can love your kids and still be wrong about what they're facing. Those two things aren't contradictory. If you're a millennial watching this, here's what I want you to take away. You're not crazy. You're not entitled. You're not lazy. You're living through one of the most economically punishing periods in modern history, and you're doing it while being told it's your fault. That's not a character flaw. That's resilience under conditions your parents never had to endure. And if the people who raised you can't see that, it's not because you're not explaining it well enough. It's because their lens was shaped by a world that no longer exists. You don't owe them endless justification. You don't owe them proof. You owe yourself the truth, which is this: the system is broken, and you're surviving it anyway. That's not failure. That's strength. And one day, maybe the empathy gap will close. Maybe not, but your worth, your reality, your struggle, they're valid, whether anyone else acknowledges them or not. If you want to keep exploring the psychology behind generational divides, there's more here. But for now, just know this: you're seen, and you're not alone.